heritage and contemporary cultural practice. I'm delighted to be introducing this session. I'm David Codling, the Programme Director of the British Council's Cultural Protection Fund, which is devised by the British Council in partnership with the British Government's Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. We have a very full programme, so I'll be very brief this afternoon. As I say, the first of a number of conversations that will go on into 2021. There is a question and answer function, which you will find at the bottom of your screens, which you can use to make comments or ask questions, which will be then conveyed to the various speakers. There is also, as you will see, for those of you who can open that screen, British Sign Language interpretation. And also I should point out that this session is being recorded for future purposes and will be available for others. We had lots of interest from people who weren't able to join now, but wanted to listen in later. So in collaboration with Shubbak Festival, we are starting these conversations today and beginning with a discussion which is structured around three themes, which are architecture, archive and music. We're going to begin with the theme of architecture, the built heritage, the tangible heritage, and beginning first of all with a film from the archive of the Cultural Protection Fund in partnership, in this case, with the Prince Claus Fund, about a project whose protagonist, Dr. Salma Samar, will be speaking shortly, but I'll leave you now to look at a video from Hadramaut in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula on the Indian Ocean, in the eastern part of Yemen. We'll go over to that now. Thank you again for joining us. Enjoy.
Doan Mud Brick Architecture Foundation was founded in 2007 thanks to the sponsorship of Abdullah Ahmed Saeed Bukshan, who serves as chair of the board of our foundation. He gave me the go-ahead to start this foundation, and it was with the assistance and collaboration of two enthusiastic and hardworking colleagues I have in Yemen, Dr. Abdullah Ghmiyan and Ali Basad, that we put this together, the three of us. Over the last 2 years, the Prince Claus Fund and the Cultural Emergency Response received funding from the Cultural Protection Fund and the British Council in order for us to reconstruct some of the most important edifices and landmarks that were destroyed during the war on Yemen between 2015 and 2017. And that is still ongoing. Last year, we managed to restore 4 projects extremely successfully, and the success of these led us to engage in another 4 projects that we have been carrying on and still ongoing.
أنت الطعيم ضنك حاجة يا ربة الحسن من بالصوت أكرهك حتى قتلتي بفار الأجل مغنك يا ربة الحسن من بالصوت أكرهك حتى قتلتي بفار الأجل مغنك
The beauty of the completed, well-built sites and domes celebrates the restitution of this important culture and lends new hope in regenerating the war-torn heritage. Finally, the importance of all of this is not to restore sites that have been destroyed. It's more to drive home the conviction that this architecture is an important architecture for the future.
Hello, I'm Eckhard Thiemann. I'm the artistic director of Shubbak, and it is a great privilege for me to collaborate with the British Council on this series of talks. And I can't wait to hear more from Dr. Salma Dalouji later on about the work of the mud brick architecture. I would like now to introduce you to Rand Abdul-Jabbar, who is an artist who is based in Abu Dhabi, but of Iraqi heritage. And Rand, you're a contemporary artist and you trained in architecture, you're a designer, you're a visual artist, you make objects. So when we talk about heritage, what comes into people's mind, first of all, is those big archaeological sites, those monuments. But for you, the material is never just the material, it's also about memory. And actually memory is what takes you to heritage. So before we speak about a specific project of yours in Iraq, tell us just a bit how things and material and memory are important for you.
Thank you, Eckhard, and thank you, Shubbak and British Council for having me part of this event. I think, for me, my practice really engages kind of remnants of the historic, cultural, and personal narratives surrounding Iraq in particular. And I think, that sort of ranges from, the tangible relics that we see, like the archaeological sites or the kind of architectural relics, but they're also, an engagement with, the ephemera of place through history, through memory, and really an attempt to kind of give form or reconstruct the fragility of those narratives in kind of new and meaningful ways.
Thank you very much. And we're going to have a look at one of your quite long-term projects with the Al-Ana minaret in Iraq, and really of the history of the object, but also then your journey into an installation at Al Jamil Arts Center in Dubai. So maybe talk first about the minaret itself, its cycles of creation and recreations and destructions. And so let's you talk through that over the next 6 slides, please.
Yes, so the minaret of Ana is a structure that came up kind of throughout my research into sites, architectural sites that were destroyed by ISIS in Iraq. And this name kind of jumped at me because, I have a sort of personal familial connection to Ana. It's a town located in kind of northwestern Iraq near the border with Syria. And this photo that you see here is actually a photo taken by Gertrude Bell in 1909. And it was the kind of very first photographic documentation of the structure. And you see it here in 1909 in a kind of really bad state. It's been kind of worn just through natural processes. Next slide. And this is the minaret itself in the kind of mid-80s. It was really a kind of focal point for the community. And you see that there have been kind of restorative efforts that kind of really restored the entire structure. It's an octagonal structure with 8 different carved niche designs going up. Next slide.
Could I ask John to foreground the slide so they can see a little bit better?
So in the 1980s, there was a decision made to construct a dam that would, the repercussions of which were the complete submersion of the city. And the big question became kind of, what do we do with this minaret? And there were several proposals put forth. And the one that actually ended up moving forward was this plan to actually, slice the minaret into 16 sections and move it from the island where you see there over to the mainland and kind of reconstruct it in the site of New Ana, where all the residents were to be moved and displaced. And this is some documentation of that process. Next slide. And here it is in its sort of new location. And this is a photo from 2006, or so about 2 decades after its kind of first relocation. And it's a sort of ominous photo from March in 2006, because 3 months later, there was an attack on the structure by Al-Qaeda that completely destroyed it and reduced it to rubble. Next slide. So this is it kind of post-destruction. Next slide. All that remained was really that kind of base at the very bottom. And this is photos from a kind of research installation that really show the process of reconstruction that a group of local archaeologists based in Ana, led by a man named Yusuf Ad-Daham, who has become a very close collaborator on this project. And you see here, they kind of gone through the extensive effort to try to, salvage as much of the remnants of the structure itself and reconstruct it based on kind of archaeological drawings and mappings that had been conducted in the late 80s. Next slide. This is more from the kind of research installation. And I think one thing that I'd really like to point out, which will kind of become relevant a bit later in our discussion, these drawings of the minaret's carved niches, because it's sort of main or most kind of iconic element. And they're quite unique to the structure. They weren't found really anywhere else in Iraq. And they become a kind of important protagonist as the story unfolds. So I'll speak a little bit more about that later.
Thank you very much, Rand. My next question really is, the first image we've just looked at now has been taken at the Jamil Art Center in Dubai, and you are not writing just a historic book about what happened to the Al-Ana Minaret, your contemporary artist. So the destination of your research and your creativity led into a contemporary art venue rather than into an archaeological museum. So tell us your interest in why this research and your creativity needs to be placed in a contemporary arts context.
This was a kind of initial invitation by Jamil Art Center to participate in a program they have called Library Circles. And it was really kind of an invitation to practitioners or creatives that are engaging in research with this idea of thinking in public. And it came at a really wonderful time, because I had, met Yusuf and we were sort of corresponding over the phone. And I went to Iraq just a couple of months before this photo was taken, and actually got to meet him and got a lot of this content. And I had come back and I was sort of faced with this kind of overwhelming amount of information that I was really trying to kind of like go through and really understand. So this was really an opportunity to kind of start to really put that out there and really think about the project and start to put the pieces together and really think about ways that you can start to engage in a conversation or some sort of response to it. So here, this installation was really kind of trying to bring together, the kind of mainstream historic narratives, but also elements of kind of almost like a blueprint, like these drawings show you, of what's to come.
Thank you very much. Quickly take us through then the journey towards the exhibition, and at the end we will have a little film clip as well of the projections.
Mm-hmm. So what happened after the reconstruction in 2012 was basically, so they produced these molds of these carved niches that allowed them to kind of recast them onto the structure. If we go to the slide just before it. Anyway, yes, so the one after. Yeah, you can kind of see.
Can we have them full, please?
Yeah, maybe in full. Anyway, you can kind of see that the sort of production of the molds really allowed them to kind of recapture this element and recast it onto the surface of the structure. What happened after the reconstruction in 2013 was only 3 years later, the structure once again was bombed and destroyed, this time by ISIS. So it kind of went through a kind of secondary cycle of destruction. And at the moment it sits destroyed. But what survived were these molds of the carved niches. They're kind of all that you have from that story, from its kind of, you know, dislocation, reconstruction, destruction, and reconstruction once again. And so I was really interested in engaging and working with these molds as kind of remnants of this copy of a thing. So if we kind of move forward a couple of slides. One more. Yeah, so this is a photo of the mold. And basically working with Jameel Art Center, I was sort of commissioned for Phantom Limb, an exhibition last year, to work with a group of craftsmen in Ana on recasting these molds of the 8 carved niches and almost kind of giving, like once again, giving new life to these elements of the structure. We move to the next slide. So you see them now kind of sitting as these kind of solitary fragments of the overall building. Next slide. And this is an installation view, and basically the installation was the 8 casts of the Ana minarets carved niche designs, and along them were projections, video projections. The first video is of a man, it's a home video footage that I got from Yusuf's archive, and it's a man who takes his children to the edge of the river. This is before the minaret was dismantled. And he speaks to them about the minaret, and he talks to them about its importance and how it's going to be moved, like almost kind of passing on this narrative to the next generation. And the second film is a film that shows the rising water levels of the Euphrates, kind of engulfing the city of Ana, until all you see at the top is kind of the top of the palm trees. And so in a way, the Euphrates, which was sort of the lifeline of Ana for its 1,000-year histories, becomes the perpetrator of its demise. And I think we'll show a short clip. So he's telling his children, you know, this is the Salah Island, it's one of the oldest islands, and this is the famous island. This is beautiful song about that. And then this is kind of footage of the rising water levels in the Euphrates. And as I described, you see kind of just the tip of the palm tree peeking up from above the water.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and Abdul Jabbar, and we look forward to hear more of you later in the panel.
Thank you, Akar.
I would like now to introduce you to Hatem Imam from Beirut. Could you see Hatem? Please, there's Hatem. Hello. So we're moving from the physical monument-based aspect of heritage to archives. Archives used to be, or the name archive originally meant official records. And I think what has been so interesting, they're sometimes more hidden now, is how archives also can become personal, can become local, can become very specific, and uncover new narratives that are maybe not just the official narratives that the original archives should have captured. So we are following a particular project that was developed between Samandal and Arab Image Foundation that Hatem led on at the time. So I'm going to ask Hatem to just introduce us to who Samandal is, who Arab Image Foundation is for the first 5 slides. Then we have a conversation, and then we look at the work of 3 specific artists.
Hello, Eckhard, thank you. Basically, the Samandal Comics is an NGO that I formed with a group of friends. We started this in 2006, and it's basically, it started off as a comics magazine, and it developed into, you know, like a kind of like an institution, like an NGO that is concerned with everything that is related to comics. So we would, you know, like publish books, organize events, workshops, etc., participate in so many different events. I don't know if the slides can be bigger. I can't see it. So basically, if we move on to the second slide, and it basically kind of like defines Samandal's kind of like vision of how we saw basically comics. I mean, we basically called the magazine Samandal, which is English, which is Arabic for salamander. So just like any amphibious animal, it kind of lives between the land and water, just like comics live between words and images.
Can we make the slide full, please?
Yeah, so as I was saying, so it's basically between 2 worlds, the world of the image and the world of text, the world of entertainment and substance, the low brow and the raised brow, the experimental and the traditional. But really, we are talking about, you know, like an experiment into comics. And this came in a very particular time in Lebanon, in the history of Lebanon. This was right after the 2006 war, and, you know, like a lot of people in my generation felt that they had no voice, and, you know, like Lebanon was kind of divided into these 2 main factions, and we basically found a space that was easy for us to be able to express certain ideas about our role, you know, socially or politically through this particular medium. We can go to the next slide, please. So basically, as I said, it's you know, like it really started off as this comics magazine, and if we can jump straight to the slide after to talk a little bit about the Arab Image Foundation and this kind of unlikely collaboration that happened, or unusual collaboration that happened between the foundation and Samandal. So in 2009, I've put both mission statements of the Arab Image Foundation. The first is the 2009 one, where it says that the Arab Image Foundation is a non-profit organization established in Beirut in 1997. Its mission is to collect, preserve, and study photographs from the Middle East, North Africa, and the Arab diaspora. If we go to the next, the more recent mission statement on the foundation's website, it states that it's an independent association forging new pathways for photography and image practices, uniquely positioned at the intersection of artistic creation, research, and archiving. We explore, question, and confront the complex social and political realities of our time. So it's interesting that when we did this collaboration, it was kind of like at a turning point, almost in the mission of the foundation, in which the focus was not so much around, you know, like the act of archiving or preservation per se, but more as looking at this kind of archive in ways in order to re-question, you know, or to explore certain concerns that are related to the archive, or to the photograph, or to photography as a practice at large.
Thank you, Hatem. So this was the start of this collaboration, and comic book artists who the assumption might be they're more interested in the street or in science fiction or the space, actually explored an archive, a photographic archive in Beirut. Do you want to take us very briefly, we only got about 3 minutes left, through the artist's work, how they used the inspiration of the archive?
Absolutely. So if we go next to the first artist, this is Barra Rima. So his story called The Photographer's Window, like the window display of a photographer. If we go next again, we will see a collection of some of the images that he picked. So basically each artist was free to choose a collection from, like a random collection of images from the foundation. So this is the collection of Barra. And if we go next, we will see some of the pages of his comic in which you can tell that, and if we go next again, please, he uses, like this idea of repetition and of absurd exaggeration almost in the text and the image to talk about things that are relevant to basically a particular reading of these photographic practices that has to do with gender identities, where like you have, like, let's say, the practice of the male children being photographed naked, showing their genitals, basically in a kind of like an act of pride almost, and like his commentary on this subject. If we go next to the second artist, who is Mazen Kirbaj, his comic entitled Hamlet, if we go to the next slide, we will see is based entirely on one single photograph that was taken from the set of the play Hamlet that was played by Mazen's father, Antoine Kirbaj, the very famous Lebanese actor. If we go to the next slide, you will see some of these pages and how simply through, like an act of cropping and composition and repetition, he created an entire narrative from this singular image. Can we go next to the last artist, who is Hassan Zahreddin? So then in his comic called The Magic of Darkness, if we go next, we will see the selection of images. Again, a very limited selection of images in this case that are absolutely unrelated in the collection. Hassan was working, if we go next, with a very particular technique, which is etching and mezzotint. So a very, time-consuming and ancient printmaking technique. What he tried to do here is he basically worked the entire comic or the entire story based on just one single copper plate that he would engrave on, print, and then engrave on top of and erase, and try to kind of like erase almost this history that he's weaving. We can go to the next image and the one after, and you'll get a sense of the effect that this gave. You always have a kind of like a ghost image that is appearing in the background. It was almost impossible to erase, like the traces of the images that he had before. And I thought this was also quite an interesting exploration into this technique of image making in relation or in response to an invitation to talk about photography. I don't know if I've exceeded my time. I probably have.
No, thank you very much, Hatem. Really, really illuminating. One question I have for you is, this project, the Samandal edition has been in 2012, so it's not a very recent project. How has the interaction with the archive influenced the artists since? Was it a one-off, or did it spark something in their work that is continuing to today?
It was, I mean, like in this particular format, it was a one-off, but definitely there's a lot of, it kind of like opened up certain possibilities about the ways in which comics artists were dealing with the image. So we have a lot of people like Bara Rima typically, started, developing more and more this idea of using photographic elements and looking at photographic archives in his work. So did many other artists. We did get, some backlash from the comics artists who said, this is not comics, this is, you're moving Samandal into the realm of contemporary art, which, I will take this criticism happily.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
The discussion around archive, we've started with Samandil, the artists collective. We are now moving to the example we have from the Cultural Protection Fund, and I'm going to invite us to watch the film about the restoration of the Khalili Library in Jerusalem, followed by a short presentation of Jack Persekian from the Al-Ma'mal Foundation.
المكتبة الخالدية في القدس معرفة، مكان وزمان.
طريق باب السلسلة هو الطريق الأعظم في القدس، وذلك لأنه أكثر الطرق سلوكاً إلى الحرم الشريف. الباب الغربي لمدينة القدس اللي هو في هذه الأيام بنسميه باب الخليل، دخل إلى القدس كثير من الفاتحين، منهم صلاح الدين الأيوبي، لأنه القوة الضاربة العسكرية لصلاح الدين كانت في مملة.
شارع باب السلسلة من باب الحرم حتى باب المكتبة الخالدية كان فيه 8 مدارس: المدرسة البلدية، المدرسة التنكزية، بعدها وسط باب السلسلة تقريباً مدرسة دار الحديث، مقابلها تماماً مدرسة القرآن الكريم، وبعدها المدرسة الجانقية والطشطمرية، ثم المدرسة الكيلانية. هنا كان المدخل الرئيسي للمكتبة، وهنا الصورة التاريخية حيث نرى الحاج راغب مع زملائه عند افتتاح المكتبة في عام 1900. الحاج راغب رمم تربة الأمير بركة خان والمسجد وحولهما إلى مكان لاحتضان المكتبة الخالدية تلبية لرغبة والدته خديجة خانم، علماً أن المسجد والتربة هما جزء من وقف محمد علي. المكتبة الخالدية هي أول مكتبة خاصة عائلية افتتحها قاضي مقدسي لكي تصبح مكتبة عامة للجمهور.
Thank you. Very fascinating building. Can I invite Jack Persekian to elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, hi, Eckhart, and thank you for inviting me. This project, what I got involved with was the actual inaugural exhibition of this library, which we actually don't see in this video. Yet this video was part of this exhibition because my response to their invitation for an exhibition for a library was basically a question of what to present to people of this depository of ancient, historic, mainly manuscripts. So things that are in general not inaccessible to ordinary people and are very specialized. And somehow I wanted to kind of break that and show that this place has knowledge that can actually share with people, but it's how you communicate that. And I've decided that there are 3 components to this project. One is actually the place itself. The second is the time that took to put this collection of manuscripts together and create the library. And third is the actual knowledge that this place has. And so for the place itself, I produced this video that you saw, which talks about the neighborhood and the context of the library and how it's positioned and its importance vis-a-vis. I mean, it's very central in the city. The time is a timeline that I produced of the history of the collection and how it came together. So the collection itself, but also the protagonists, the people who were involved. That also entailed the family itself, the Khalidi family, who started collecting the books from the 18th century. And third is the actual knowledge that to me is represented through samples of these books that we presented for the exhibition, but also some of the research that was done. So for example, the Palestine Exploration Fund sent specialists to document the Mamluk buildings adjacent to the Moghrabi neighborhood right after the War of 67, because they heard that immediately after the fall of the city in 1967, the Israelis bulldozed the whole Moghrabi neighborhood right in front of the Wailing Wall. And this library and that Tariq al-Silsile, the Silsile street in the old city, is just adjacent to the Moghrabi quarter. And so they sent in Archie Walls, a specialist who really did a thorough and documentation and survey of this building and its content, and presented it then, for fear that if something happens and this building is destroyed by the Israelis as a consequence of the war, then they have something like documentation of it. And so I presented that work too in the presentation, and I made it in a way where you have information that can inspire kids, school kids, as well as people who are specialists and who need information for their research or whatever. So breaking that sort of self-isolation that the library had put itself for many years, for many reasons, but one very good reason is that there's the settlers who are, as I said, after destroying the Moghrabi neighborhood, started taking over some of the buildings around the Wailing Wall, and one of them happens to be this library. And so they were encroaching on the neighborhood, and they already took the building next doors to the library, and they were trying by all means to kind of kick them out of the library. And so they were very protective and very much closed. So with this whole project was to also open up the library and allow it to be visited, as I said, by specialists, but also by school kids and people who are visiting the city in general.
Thank you very much, Jag. Very, very enriching, and to hear those political contexts as well, and the danger that those monuments and collections face. We now will move on to our third theme, which is music, which is part of the intangible heritage work that does not have necessarily material value to it, but lives in the moment of performance. The first thing we are going to see is a short documentary about the project by Action for Hope that is teaching music to Syrian refugee communities. Could we see the film, please, of Action for Hope?
فغرا
wonderful renditions of traditional Syrian music. You've seen the names on the screens of the musicians, and they are all graduates in Lebanon and Jordan of the Action for Hope music schools. The first song is actually quite seasonal. It's a Syriac hymn that is normally presented during Christmas. And the second one is a well-known music from Tad, that is special to Aleppo in Syria. I will now move on to Amir Al-Safar. America, Chicago, New York, based trumpet player, santur player, multi-instrumentalist, ensemble leader, and researcher who's really working with across genres, across styles, with a wide range of collaborators. So we will stay with music, that wonderful intangible form that only becomes alive in performance. Before we hear a little bit from your work, and the first example of your work, which is the Rivers of Sound Ensemble, tell us a little bit about the ensemble and how you brought this into being, and then we'll hear a little bit of the music.
Sure. Thank you, Eckhard, and thank you to the Shubbak Festival and British Council for inviting me today, joining you from New York, Brooklyn, New York. So yeah, just briefly about the Rivers of Sound Orchestra. It's a 17-piece ensemble consisting of musicians coming from different traditions. So we have al-maqam al-Iraqi, which is a style that I've spent many years researching and learning and performing, as well as jazz music from New York and from other parts of the US and from around the world. Western classical music plays a big role. There's also Carnatic Indian music. There's a lot of different traditions that come together, but at its core, Rivers of Sound is a community, and musically speaking, all that happens is more a result of the camaraderie and the interaction through improvisation, through this group dynamic that's developed over 5 years, but it's actually more like 15 or 20 years, because all the musicians have had musical relationships with me and many with each other throughout decades. And so it's really a special project to lead, but also to feel like I'm a member of. And you'll see in the video, there's a wide range of instruments such as the oud, the buzuq, santur, saxophones, vibraphones, and coming together to create this general pursuit of beauty. So let's give a listen.
Thank you very much. Let's listen to a bit over a minute. Thank you. Just a tiny glimpse of the Rivers of Sound Ensemble. What strikes me, Amir, is really what we're hearing. For me, it really sounds like Amir Al-Safar composition. It's not just a fusion of different elements, and yet there's so many musical languages in there. So tell us a little bit about how you join up those musicians and those forms from such different genres, and which ones were in this short clip that we've just heard.
Well, in that 1 minute, I suppose there were several things happening harmonically. There's a jazz sensibility and underpinning that's dealing with particular types of extended chords. Rhythmically, there's a carnatic sensibility where you hear something in 3 but also in 7 at the same time. And then the melody, of course, as you probably can hear, is coming from maqam or coming from an Arabic, Iraqi sensibility. But there's quarter tones that are inserted throughout the whole thing. So even though there's piano, which is typically Western instrument, we've retuned the piano to include the microtones that are part of the maqam tradition. Vibraphone has been retuned, the guitar is retuned. And that creates another kind of sound. The tones kind of interact with each other in new ways that are not already established, especially when they're projected onto a harmonic canvas. And I think, you know, in terms of how we get to this sound, and this was of course just a short example, but in my life, I mean, I grew up in Chicago. I was trained in Western classical music as well as jazz. Before that, I was a guitarist playing Beatles songs as a teenager, and Rolling Stones and Jimi Hendrix and all the rest. But eventually, in my 20s, I went on a journey to Baghdad to learn the maqam Iraqi, studying with many of the masters there. But I left in 2002, just about several months before the US invasion. And I actually spent a lot of my time in London studying with maqam reciter Hamid al-Saadi, who is the leading exponent of the maqam Iraqi and the only person alive who knows this entire tradition. And we're talking about thousands of years of musical history that have been sort of filtered through these various civilizations and various epochs of Iraq's history. So it's something that's in danger of being lost. It's been inscribed on UNESCO's intangible heritage list and in 2003, and it's something that I seek to not only preserve but to bring into contact with new forms in order to allow it space to continue to thrive in contemporary societies.
And to take such deep interest in an historic form and spending a long time learning it, and I remember you telling me once how long it took to get into the form to learn the techniques. For you as an artist, how did you feel, what was the relationship between kind of preservation and new creation? Did you have to give up something for this? Did it lead you somewhere that may have hindered your other creativity? What is the relationship between preserving and learning historic material and keeping the innovative spirit? And you're taking big liberties in your work, the innovative spirit alive.
Yeah, I mean, I had been, at the time that I started studying maqam Iraqi, I was already a professional trumpet player, having played in symphony orchestras in Chicago and working with jazz groups in New York, and suddenly as a 25-year-old, I became a beginner again. And I really felt like I was not even, like I felt I was below beginner because I didn't grow up in Iraq. I didn't have this music intuitively and instinctively part of my sensibility. So I had to kind of forget what I'd learned and sort of re-immerse myself or immerse myself in a place that I'd never really lived in, and it kind of doesn't exist anymore because the culture in which the maqam Iraqi was born the society has changed, the culture doesn't really exist in the same way. So through my connection with Hamid, through others, at the beginning I was not interested in innovating, I just wanted to receive as much as I could. And I think I was lucky that during the same period I was working with jazz pianist Cecil Taylor, who was one of the most innovative and wildly expansive creative musicians in the world, who just passed away 2 years ago. And he was constantly encouraging me to expand my boundaries. So I think that dichotomy is where I eventually was able to find my own voice between this very contemporary and very traditional sound.
Thank you. So let's listen for a moment of the very traditional, the very authentic, the historical material where you play alongside Hamid al-Saadi on the santur.
Yeah.
وحظ كل ما
Thank you very much. I think this is all we have time for listening to Amir Safar. Extraordinary skill that you have brought into fruition after unlearning your previous skills that you had. These have been now 6 examples, both 3 from the Cultural Protection Fund, 3 from artists who have worked with Shubbak. Examples of an interest, skepticism and exploration, risk-taking with heritage, and how we can look into the past to invent something new. This is the time now to give the floor to our 6 panelists to dig into these questions a little bit further. And I would like to invite Jumana Al-Yassiri to lead this discussion. Jumana is a wonderful curator, producer, art theorist who has led many discussions, including at Shubbak before, who will now help us unpick or find some of those questions that this very broad panorama of presentations has presented us. So over to you, Jumana, and I will ask the 3 artists back, as well as Farah Kadur, the program officer and assistant artistic supervisor from Action for Hope, Dr. Salma Daluji from the Dawan Matbek Architecture Foundation, and Jack Kasakin from the Ma'amal Foundation.
Thank you, Eckhart. Hello, everyone. I am so happy to be here with you all and really honored to be part of this conversation. We don't have a lot of time. I wish that I can take each one of you for a very long drink and like to talk for hours about these very important topic. Unfortunately, we have 30 minutes for this. Before we start, I would like to remind our audience that if they have any questions, they can send it to us in the Q&R section, and we will get to these questions at the end of the discussion. First of all, I would like to start with a question about the 3 Cultural Protection Funds projects. From Syrian musical heritage to Yemen's architectural heritage and Palestine archival heritage, these initiatives are undeniably acts of resistance against historical violence and the dangers of disappearance. What role, in your opinion, the preservation of tangible and intangible heritage play in the political landscape of a tormented territory? How to negotiate with official dominant narratives and even give hope when the future seems so dark and obstructed? In the 3 examples we heard about today, there is a lot of hope in the act of preservation and protection of heritage. Dr. Salma, maybe we can start with you.
Good evening. Thank you. I think my video, for those who could see it, because I understood a lot of people got the wrong link. For those who saw the video in its entirety, I think I've exactly discussed these points, in that essentially it's not about reconstruction or restoration or rehabilitation. But I don't use terms such as resistance and defiance, because when you resist and when you defy is when you do not need to use such terminology anyway. But that the importance essentially of this type of architecture is, of course, to endorse and consolidate the importance of that the community and the inhabitants attach to their own culture, to their own spiritual beliefs, in the case of our buildings being related to Sufi tombs. And all of this gives a form of, once you resuscitate buildings, you are resuscitating lives in general. And with that, of course, you're looking to inspiring people and giving them, you call it hope, I call it aspiration. I don't know if I've answered your question.
You did. Maybe Farah, we can continue with you. I think that I actually attended one of the concerts with the children from the music school, and there was something very, very joyful about it. And what the question I left with after the concert is, are these children going to pursue a career in music also, because you're giving them career perspectives and the possibility to go out of what seems like an impossible living condition? We lost Farah. We don't hear you, Farah.
I can see you're there.
No.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Is it working now?
It's very quiet. Are you? But give it a go. Thank you.
Okay. Is it working now? Hello.
Yeah, it's working.
I'm trying to.
Yes.
Okay. So, hi again. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are. Yeah.
Thank you for inviting us. Thank you, Shubbak Festival and British Council, and thank you, Jumana. Actually, yes, we work in Action for Hope from two perspectives. The first one is to discover these distressed talents that actually live in a very hard conditions. Most of them are refugees. And the other half are living actually in Lebanon or in Jordan in bad conditions. So they don't have access to art, to learn art or to practice art. So we just try to provide them with many sessions and instruments and workshops to help them build a career. To be professional musicians. So that's the very big aim, to make them professional musicians for the future. And the second aim is to just connect them with their heritage and their traditional music, because due to the conditions and to everything going now, they're a bit disconnected from the traditional music that they have in their countries, talking about the Syrian heritage or the Iraqi one or the Palestinian one. So we're just trying to build the connection again between them that they have.
Thank you. Jack, I don't know if you are with us. We're only seeing your shoulder. What do you think, Jack, about the political dimension of the act of preservation heritage, especially in, I think of Palestine as the perfect example to talk about the act of resistance when preserving heritage. So yeah. Can you just tell us more about your work? You talked about the library. I know that also through Al-Ma'mal and several other projects you were involved in. Yeah. This is almost a daily mission.
Yeah, true. And I don't need to explain to everybody. I think everybody knows and quite well informed about the situation. But yet I like very much what Dr. Salmat said regarding resuscitating a building means resuscitating life, and this is true. This is absolutely true. And even when we think about the confrontation with the Israelis here on the ground, maybe in Jerusalem, where I am now, it is about the buildings, the place, the land, and who gets to control what, which means eventually to control life. But I also see the dimension that Farah was talking about, which is about learning and allowing people to kind of to help people find jobs, make a better life. And I think my work here is basically trying to kind of connect both, i.e. on one hand, if we look at the Khalid library, I mean, it's good that the library is there to preserve the collection of manuscripts and books, and it's good there to be there as a monument and as a monument for the presence of Palestinian Arab culture and heritage in the city. But it's also important that this becomes, as I said before, useful and something that we can draw knowledge and learn from. And that's why it needs these interpretations. And these interpretations we see more now happening in contemporary art, where artists are able to bridge, are able to open up to different practices and to kind of connect the different fields, be it architecture, be it education, be it science, be it archaeology, politics, and everything else, and somehow mold it and form it into projects and tools for us to learn from and for us to use. So that's what I think is happening and needs to always be stressed, that you know, what we do in terms of resistance and steadfastness, again, as Dr. Salma said, is not good enough on its own. It needs to be coupled with you know, clear ideas of how this can eventually improve the situation around us. How can this be? How can this infiltrate the education system? How can we use this in schools where children would learn more about their history, about their heritage, about their culture, and maybe particularly, which is something that I'm very much involved with and something that we started at Al-Ma'mal, which is visual literacy. And that, I think, is paramount in trying to bridge all these kind of different disciplines.
Thank you. Well, speaking about history and arts education, I feel that there is poor, if not lack of archival efforts in terms of contemporary artistic creation in the Arab world, official archival efforts. And I was once in a conversation with film and contemporary art curator Rasha Salti about the lack of or very poor archival material about contemporary Arab arts in the making. Her answer to that was, well, dictatorships hate archives. Whether it's the work of the Arab Image Foundation in Lebanon or the work of Atasi Foundation concerning Assyrian visual arts, these are always individual initiatives, whether by artists or cultural activists, cultural leaders. I wonder why when the artist wears the hat of a researcher and or historian, he or she become such a threat to the state and the status quo. And in your opinion, as artists and cultural leaders, what is the reason behind this fear of contemporary archive in the region? Maybe we can start with you, Hatem, and open the question to the group.
Yes, hi, Jumana. I think, I mean, in Lebanon in particular, we have this burning question, you know, like about, you know, like like some people call it amnesia, or like an active act of trying to erase or you know, like get past certain events in the past, such as, you know, like the civil war and whatnot. And you know, like there's a lot of theorists and historians who have talked about this, whether it is in the field of cultural production or even, you know, like in other fields as well. And you know, I went to Northern Ireland, and I was shocked at like how their strategy of dealing with their history is almost like the exact polar opposite of what we have here, where every single thing is not only archived and cataloged, it's also made public. So you can go to the public library and watch every single film that has been made during the Troubles. And you will find every last leaflet and ashtray and any artifact that has been produced during the time that references the IRA or any kind of like trouble that was happening of their civil strife is documented and made available for everyone to see. And in both of these cases, I feel like there was a kind of at the beginning I felt like, oh, this is this is wonderful that like there's like this accessibility is quite fantastic, that you could actually go and look and read your history and understand and maybe come to terms with it. But eventually I found that actually it really isn't a solution, because it's not the simple act of preservation or archiving that matters. It's actually what you do with this kind of archive, and this is where like like I think that the main question is how we deal like with this archive. It's not enough for me to come and say this is all of the work of like contemporary artists in the Arab world or musicians or whatnot. I think that there is a very important also political question here, and the role in which like how do we deal with this kind of material?
It's like creating the archive. Rand, maybe you want to tell us about your own experience? You spoke a little bit about that with Eckhart, but and also from the work of other artists and work you've experienced as an observer.
In terms of the construction of archive?
In terms of the construction of archive, or lack of or poor archival material around modern and contemporary Arab arts. We lost you. Oh, yeah, just the window. Change, please. Or the fear of archive in some part of the world.
I mean, just kind of speaking maybe from a bit more of a personal experience in dealing with archive is, for example, with the ANA project, it is a history that is untold. It's a history that is not very well documented. And it was really through engagement with people that have, like someone like Mr. Yusuf Adham, who I mentioned, who had sort of direct involvement and kind of out of his own initiative felt a sort of responsibility to care for documenting this history and preserving it, that I was really able to kind of access these archival documents and then kind of like try to narrate this story to a wider public. And it was really about kind of piecing together pieces of the puzzle and trying to build a kind of narrative out of it. I think it's, in the case of Iraqi, there's also the issue of kind of this erasure of history with every subsequent kind of political move. The archive is, of course, a very political tool, and it is one that kind of serves a purpose, especially if it's kind of coming from the state level. And so I feel like, what I'm sort of interested in, which is, an example of which is the project around the minaret of Ana, is also kind of like, documenting, let's say, more oral narratives or personal experiences, and really trying to kind of, have those become part of a narrative that I feel, my story has been excluded from, or the story of my community and their kind of personal experiences. And I'm working right now with the Shubbak Festival, actually in a participatory project with a group of women from the Iraqi diaspora in London, really exploring these themes. How do you feel if you've kind of been erased from the history, or the representations of the place that you're from just don't match at all with your own experience of it, and your story is sort of not there at the forefront? So I think, my interest is really kind of looking at, memory, personal archives, and trying to kind of formulate ways that these can, be given some sort of form or some sort of medium for them to serve as part of a kind of a documentation of personal histories and narratives.
Thank you. Well, I suggest that we take one question from the audience before I get to my final question, because it sort of introduces it. And this is a question for you, Amir, in particular, and everyone here is welcome to respond, of course. It's from Christina Hasboun. She says, I'm wondering about the relationship between preservation and innovation. Tangible heritage seems to be more archived and frozen in time. However, intangible heritage, and specifically music, is constantly evolving and reflecting the spirit of its time, especially from the Arabic-speaking countries. I'd love to hear Amir's opinion on the relationship between preservation and innovation, and at what point does innovation preservation turn into a completely new element?
Very good question. And I think it ties in well with the theme we're just discussing. Because the way I view al-Maqam al-Iraqi, this is a repertoire that's been, as I mentioned before, it's been, it's hundreds of years old. It's also thousands of years old. It's also some parts of it are very recent. It's a constantly evolving form. And the Maqam al-Iraqi is itself an archive. It's an oral archive of Iraq's history, in the sense that you have these melodies that actually represent, they're time capsules that represent certain eras of, one melody is about the Mongol invasion of 1258 when Baghdad was destroyed. One melody is coming from a Persian, story of a Persian tradesmen who came to Baghdad and started singing, and eventually this piece was preserved. There are Turkish melodies, Kurdish melodies. There's a whole mixing of different cultures that goes on in the Maqam Iraqi that is itself a perfect reflection of how Iraq has the phases of Iraq's history, and even in the 20th century, there have been additions to the maqam that even reflected pan-Arab nationalism that we saw in the 1920s, going to the middle of the 20th century, and even during Saddam's time, it became more used as a political tool for somewhat for propaganda. But we also see in very recently some changes that are happening in Maqam Iraqi that are reflecting occupation and reflecting the current state. So it's something that because it's a sonic archive as opposed to a physical preserved archive, there's the capacity for adaptation and change and absorption of elements that are around, and whatever's relevant today is kind of what persists. And so when we talk about innovation and tradition, it's a dichotomy that I think needs to be examined, because yes, there is tradition, there's sort of what we've learned by rote, and there's something that we do want to preserve, we want to stay connected, but tradition was never, in its history, was never about staying stuck in that. Even when you go back centuries in the history of oral traditions, musicians and instrumentalists and singers were constantly updating. They were not supposed to just imitate the person before them. They're supposed to add something, to change something, to bring something of their own self or their current environment or what was going on at the time. So this idea that tradition is innovation. Innovation is built within the traditional forms within. So then we say, do we need to even have these dichotomies anymore? Do we need this binary between tradition and innovation? Whereas, we think of Western contemporary music as being sort of a break with tradition, and yet it's a language, and it is based on tradition. And when you hear how people innovate today, there's a trajectory. So even in written music that has, it seems to be somehow not as connected to the past or not as reliant on the past, we see that there's actually a continuum. So I don't know exactly where one stops and the other begins, because I see it really as a continuum.
Thank you, Amir. Well, speaking about preservation and innovation, this brings me to my last point. There is something profoundly sacred about cultural heritage, especially when it comes to what has been stated as golden ages and national treasures. Today, we are witnessing global movements of questioning and even revoking the untouchability of what has become through time part of the foundation of national identities. Artists and cultural activists are playing key roles in these movements, whether as a response to oppressive national narratives or even to decolonize collective memories. We know that tangible and intangible heritage are often key tools for propaganda and colonial behaviors. So what space does critical thinking have in the conversation around cultural heritage? Does geographical and historical distance, and I'm thinking here about the diasporas, allow a more uninhibited relation to cultural heritage? And is it even necessary to desacralize sometimes this cultural heritage? Jack, maybe we can start with you. I always try to bring Jack. Bring Jack. Come back, Jack.
Yeah. Well, and I take your point, Jumana, and I completely subscribe to what you said. But I'm not actually worried about I'm not even interested in discussion and comes between the diaspora and the people, in that particular region, and what can bring a sort of what can inject life into this untouchable treasure. Because if we only think about heritage and things that are coming from the past as fixed and almost dead objects, then we're actually trying to kill what we're doing if we're going to be stuck with that history. And maybe, as Amir had said, this should be seen as more an organic process, that things get taken or borrowed from the past and is molded and formed and is interpreted in new ways. And as I mentioned before, contemporary art does that at its best. I think our problem, and I don't want to keep repeating myself, I think our problem is in our education, in how we're in our upbringing, and what we learn at school and at home, and how we are able to basically take apart this very complex visual, tangible and intangible system, and try to see it as elements that we can reorganize and put together in new ways and forms. And again, I refer to what Amir had said. It's like borrowing and interpreting it using a plethora of sources and readings and techniques. So my concern is how we can basically move on in our education system to some form of visual literacy that can connect, that can connect imagery and symbols and shapes and colors and forms and structures that are well, kind of documented and present in that history and in that past and in that, kind of golden ages, but also see it how artists and artisans and architects and engineers and designers see it. So we need more of those. And to have more in society, more people who see it with these sensibilities, is you need to teach that at school. You cannot depend on the few talented. You need to move the whole society in that direction. And this is what the West did. When they were reforming the whole education system at the end of the 19th century, this is what they exactly did. Is they introduced crafts and craftsmanship in the school education, in the curriculum.
Thank you, Jack. Dr. Selma, would you like to add something about the sacrality and unsacrality of cultural heritage? You are on mute. Yeah.
Yes, I said, what was it you wanted me to add on in terms of the cultural heritage? What was the word you used?
The sacrality.
Did you say the sexuality?
No, I said sacrality, I didn't say sexuality.
Oh, sacrality.
Yeah, the sacred.
The accent, it's okay.
But if you want, yes, sure.
Yeah, but I mean, what's wrong with that? Yeah, what do you mean by sacrality of the heritage?
My question was about the space for critical thinking when we are dealing with what is considered as national treasures and golden ages, and how much critical or not, and if it's even necessary to have like the distance we can put with the object, and even be critical about what ages has been stated as a treasure and untouchable.
I tell you something, it's very, such a discussion and conversation is essentially purely theoretical for someone like an architect who is actually working with what is called or labeled as the cultural heritage, when we are actually working with a system that for us is more about whatever it embodies in terms of cultural heritage is something inherent that people take for granted, the people and the communities who live there take for granted. But it's unfortunately, it's like the last speaker commenting on the fact that crafts started to be taught at school. But yes, at the same time, you have to understand the historic context and the background to this. So there isn't enough time to explain what I'm saying. All I want to say is the following. When you are working with what is labeled as cultural heritage or urban heritage or terms like Islamic architecture or vernacular architecture or the cultural kind of spaces, etc., these are all inherent in a daily working way of life that we have in terms, for example, of building. The master builders that we have in Yemen, for example, are maybe the rarest people left on earth. They are a cultural heritage. But they are much more important than this. They embody a very, very important language. It's a language and a vocabulary that is being lost and eroded by this kind of total kind of abandonment of the one's own understanding and language. So in terms of going back to crafts and teaching, if you go back to Ibn Khaldun, it's quite obvious that unless there is the need and the market for these crafts, no one is interested in learning these crafts. Because, I mean, if it's not related and it's not that, this is why I'm talking about tangible, intangible heritage and cultural heritage and all these kind of terms. I find if you are trying to say something, but as far as what we're working on here, a theme that might, if you like, tie most of these presentations, I say most, but I'm talking in particular about Palestine, about the Syrian music, about Yemen, or about the destruction of Ana, for example, in Iraq, and the destruction of many other monuments there and in Syria, is what at the moment we are trying to fight is something much more important. It's trying to fight despair. And I wanted to add this, I think, to, I'm sorry, I don't know the name of the guy who's in the Khalidi. Oh, Jack. When Jack, at the end of his first talk, I mean, I couldn't come in to say that it's about despair. It's about kind of creating an account of something that has been destroyed, whether in contemporary artwork that are symbolic of Ana, fine. And I disagree with you when you said that dictators are not interested or fight artists who dress as, who have a historian's hat, etc. And the best example of this was Saddam Hussein. Irrespective of what you think, whether you like or dislike the man, he was a dictator. And throughout his period as dictator, we find that Iraq was one of the most important centers for publishing, for reading, and for publishing. They used to say, the Iraqis read, and Lebanon publishes, and the Iraqis read. And some of the most important archiving that took place, and especially in as far as art is concerned and contemporary, was during this period. I'm not saying it didn't happen before, it did, but there was a continuity. So I'm not sure that it's true that dictators don't like archiving. On the contrary.
Thank you so much, Dr. Selma. I'm so sorry, but we are running now out of time. Eckhart, next panel, dictatorship and archives. This is the topic of our coming panel, please. It seems that we are having like a very interesting debate about that. Thank you, everyone, so much. Eckhart and David, I leave it to you to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Jumana. Thank you indeed. This was the first of several conversations. They will continue early in 2021, collaboration between the British Council, Cultural Protection Fund, and Shubbak Festival. And that was a fascinating discussion. I want to thank all of our participants, all of the speakers, and also Jumana for leading this discussion about what has been, whether it was destroyed, whether it's hidden, but still bearing witness and still meaningful for the present and indeed for the future. I would like to thank once again our partners, our allies, Shubbak Festival, for this collaboration. It's a great honor, as always, to work with them. I also want to thank our sign language interpreters who've been very busy throughout all of this 90 minutes, and to thank John Gibson, who is, as technical manager, the person who's held this all together. Thank you very much indeed, John, and above all, to thank all of you for joining us. Do join us again. Follow the link, which my colleague Sumaya has put on the chat, to the recording and also to the dates for the future discussions early in 2021. Thank you and goodbye.